Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Colors of Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley, starting with chapter 11. But first, reading updates. So I finished several books. I finished Bird Box by Josh Mallerman, and the review is up on Patreon. I did enjoy it. I listened to it on audio, and it is a movie on Netflix with Sandra Bullock. I have not seen the movie as of yet, but I did enjoy it, and it is kind of like if you've seen uh, A Quiet Place. It's kind of like that, except instead of like having to be quiet all the time, it's like you can't like have your eyes open when you're outside because there's like these creatures. So it is like a psychological horror. We never actually see the monster, or do we? I'm not gonna say anything. But yeah, I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it. I also finished Blue Lock Volume 6. I have Volume 7 in transit. I'm just really enjoying it. Overall, it is a story about 200, 300, some amount of hundreds of top forward high school players in soccer who have been gathered together in this competition, this very intense competition to become part of the Japanese national team. And it is just so dramatic and so good. And I love it so much. I started reading it because I watched the anime and it only gets to a certain point and it's like, well, I need to know what happens. So the part that I'm reading now, has already been published in the anime. So like there's nothing new, but I'm still just like really enjoying it and being like, "Oh yeah, and then that happens. Oh yeah, and then this is going to happen." So it's still a joyful occasion for me. And then I did finish In the Lives of Puppets by TJ Klune. I picked it up because it was the science fiction winner for the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2023, and overall it was okay. I really liked the like first third better than the second two thirds. Yeah, better than the other two thirds. I just have a hard time with like endings in general, and I think the ending or like how I think that something is going to end, if it's different, and this isn't like, I shouldn't be judging books on their ending because it's not the ending that I thought it should be, but I do. But it is a different ending than I thought that it should be, and the resolution is a little bit longer than I thought that it would be, but it is about this guy named Victor who lives with his android dad and two robots, Nurse Ratchet and Rambo. And one day when he's in the scrapyard, he finds another android named Hap, and Hap is in not so great of shape. So Vic takes him home, puts them together, and from there, things get wild. That's when our journey begins. So I did enjoy it. And then I started Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree, and I am really liking it. I started it yesterday. I'm on page 93, about to start chapter 12. And it is the same author and the same world of Legends and Lattes, and it is the same character. So I started this not knowing if it was going to be like the same people or anything like that. It is the same orc. And this actually happens before Legends and Lattes. So Viv is an orc, a mercenary orc who gets injured on the job, and the rest of her crew drop her off in this small seaside town, and they leave her there for her to get better because she's been wounded. And while she's doing this, she is around town, everything, and there's a cute little bookshop, and she goes in there, and it's like falling apart. And so far, it is Viv falling in love with reading for the first time, like ever, which is so magical to see. And also her trying to help the owner of the bookshop because the bookshop is falling apart to be like, hey, maybe you should paint and things like that. And also there's like a bookshop like dog hybrid, and his name is Pot Roast. Obviously, it's amazing. So it's very cozy, very good. I'm enjoying it. And think I think that's all that's going on right now. Yeah. But today, the book that we are reading is The Colors of Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. And we're starting with chapter 11. And okay, recap. So we have this boy, Bart, who has just graduated from the Academy of something. I don't remember the name of the academy, but he's just graduated and he is waiting on this planet with his friend for his dad to come to whisk him back to his home planet so that he can take over the family business. And a ship does arrive, but it's not his dad. It's somebody else. And the somebody else is pretending to be his dad and pulls him aside and is like, dude, you need to pretend that I'm your dad because we're in trouble. And so Bart sort of goes along with this. We find out from this guy, like pretending to be his dad, that his dad is in trouble and they don't know where he is or what has happened, but he has to get Bart away. And he only knows two things. He knows the eighth color, which he passes that information on to Bart, and he knows Rylon 3, which he also passes on to Bart. And so he also gives him like a new identity, identification papers, all of these things, and tells him to like go onto the ship. And so Bart goes on the ship, he dyes his hair a different color, all of these things. There's this alien race called the Lhari. There we go. I knew if I just for a minute that it would come to me. The Lhari. And the Lhari are the only race that know how to do like hyperdrive in space travel. And there is this plot that his dad was part of to infiltrate and pretend that he was part of this alien race to figure out how to do this and how to like what the secret sauce is basically and pass it along to other people so that the Lhari don't have a monopoly on this sort of travel. And in doing this, we find out that his dad was going to undergo plastic surgery to make himself look more like the alien race. And in the surgery, he has died. And so Bart is now like, well, I'm going to take up this torch and I'm going to be the person to carry out my father's unfinished business. So he does that and he meets up with somebody that is also part of this like coup that's involved in like the overthrowing of this information. And that person is like, all right, well, we're gonna start a war. And Bart's like, well, that's not really what I signed up for. Like, they're peaceful people. The people that I like the Lhari that I traveled with, like, they don't mean any harm. Like, they're friendly. They're my friends, type of a thing. And the guy's like, well, you're either with us or you're against us. And so Bart agrees. Okay, cool. I guess I will do this for my dad to carry out what he was going to do. So that's where we ended. It's like, all right, I guess we're going to war. Here we go. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Just gentle topics. No big deal. No big deal. It's fun. All right, so let's get cozy. Let's get comfy cozy. I'm gonna have another sip of water because I'm dehydrated, and then we'll get right into it. Chapter 11. But although he thought he had settled all the conflict, he found that it returned when he was lying in his bunk, or when he stood in the dome and watched the stars, while they moved through the Antares system toward the captive sun and the tiny planet Lharilis. It's in my power to give this to all men. Should a few Lhari stand in his way? He lay in his bunk brooding, thinking of death, staring at the yellow radiation badge. If you fail, it won't be in our lifetime. He'd have to go back to little things, to the little ships that hauled piddling cargo between little planets, while all the grandeur of the stars belonged to the Lhari. And if he succeeded, Vega Interplanet could spread from star to star a mighty memorial of Rupert Steele. One day, Vorongil sent for him. "Bartle," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "You and Ring have always been good friends, so don't be angry about this. He's worried about you. Says you spend all your spare time in your bunk growling at him. Is there anything the matter, Feathertop?" He sounded so concerned, the word struck Bart with hysterical humor, so fatherly, that Bart wanted insanely to laugh and to cry. Instead, he muttered, Ring should mind his own business. "But it's not like that," Vorongil said. "Look, the Swift Wing's a world, young fellow, and a small one. If one being in the world is unhappy, it affects everyone." Bart had an absurd, painful impulse to blurt out the incredible truth to Vorongil and try to get the old Lhari to understand what he was doing. But fear held him silent. He was alone, one small human in a ship of Lhari. Vorongil was frowning at him, and Bart mumbled, "It's nothing. Ryoko Mori." "I suppose you're pining for home," Vorongil said kindly. "Well, it won't be long now." The glare of the captive sun grew and grew in the ports, and Bart's dread mounted. He had, as yet, had no opportunity to put the radiation counter out of order. It was behind a panel in the drive room, and try as he might, he could think of no way to get to it unobserved. Sometimes, in sleepless nights, it seemed that would be the best way. Just let it go. But then the Lhari would detect Montano's ship and kill Montano and his men. Did he believe that? He had to believe it. It was the only way he could possibly justify what he was doing. And then his chance came, as so many chances do when one no longer wants them. The second officer met him at the beginning of one watch, saying worriedly, "Bartle, old Rugel's sick, not fit to be on his feet. Do you think you can hold down this shift alone? If I drop in and give you a hand from time to time?" "I think so," Bart said, carefully not overemphasizing it. The second officer, by routine, spent half of his time in the drive room and half his time down below in maintenance. When he left, Bart knew he would have at least half an hour, uninterrupted, in the drive room. He ripped open the panel, located the wires, and hesitated. He didn't quite dare to cut them outright. He jerked one wire loose, frayed the other with a sharp claw until it was almost in shreds and would break with the first surge of current, pulled two more connections loose so that they were not making full contact. He closed the panel and brushed dust over it, and when the second officer came back, Bart was at his own station. As Antares fell toward them in the viewport, he found himself worrying about Mentorians. They would be in cold sleep, presumably in a safe part of the ship, behind shielding, or Montano would have made provisions for them. Still, he wished there was a way to warn Meta. He was not on watch when they came into the planetary field of Lharilis, but when he came on shift, he knew at once that the trouble had been located. The panel was pulled open, the exposed wires hanging, and Ring was facing old Rugel, shouting, "Listen, Baldy, I won't have you accusing me of going light on my work. I checked those panels 8 days ago. Tell me who's going to be opening the panels in here anyhow." No, Rugel said impatiently. "I'm not accusing you of anything, only being careless, young Ring. You poke with those buzzing instruments and things. Maybe once you tear loose some wires." Bart remembered he wasn't supposed to know what was going on. What's this all about? It was Rugel who answered. The radiation counter, the planetary one, not the one we use in space, is out of order. We don't even need it this landing. There's no radiation on Lhari. If it were the landing gear now, that would be serious. I'm just trying to tell Ring. He's trying to say I didn't check it. Ring was not to be calmed. It's my professional competence. Forget it, Bart said. If Rugel isn't sore about it, and if we don't need it for landing, why worry? He felt like Judas. Just take a look at my daybook, Ring insisted. I checked and marked it service fit, I tell you. Somebody was blundering around, opening panels where they had no business, tore it out by accident, then was too much of a filthy sneak to report it and get it fixed. Bartol was on watch, alone, one night, said the second officer. But you wouldn't meddle with panels, would you, Bartol? Bart set his teeth, steadying his breathing, as Ring turned hopefully to him. Bartol, did you, by mistake, maybe? Because if you did, it won't count against your rating, but it means a black mark against mine. Bart hid his self-contempt in sudden tense fury. No, I didn't. You're going to accuse everybody on the Swiftwing, all the way from me to Varangil, before you can admit a mistake, aren't you? If you want somebody to blame, look in a mirror. Listen, you. Ring's pent-up rage exploded. He seized Bart by the shoulder, and Bart moved to throw him off, so that Ring's outthrust claws raked only his forearm. In pure reflex, he felt his own claws flick out. They clinched, closed, scuffled, and he felt his claws rake flesh. Half incredulous, saw the thin red line of blood welling from Ring's cheek. Then Rugel's arms were flung restrainingly around him, and the second officer was wrestling with a furious, struggling Ring. Bart looked at his red-tipped claws in ill-concealed horror, but it was lost in a general gasp of consternation, for Varangil had flung the drive-room door open, taking in the scene in one blistering glance. What's going on down here? For the first time, Bart understood Varangil's reputation as a tyrant. One glance at Ring's bleeding face and Bart's ripped forearm, and he did not pause for breath for a good 15 minutes. By the time he finished, Bart felt he would rather Ring's claws had laid him bleeding to the bone than stand there in the naked contempt of the old Lhari's freezing eyes. Half-fledged, nestlings trying to do a man's work. So someone forgot the panel, or damaged the panel by mistake. No, not another word, he commanded as Ring's crest came proudly up. I don't care who did what. Any more of this, and the one who does it can try his claws on the captain of the Swiftwing. He looked ugly and dangerous. I thought better of you both. Get below, you squalling kittens. Let me not see your faces again before we land. As they went along the corridor, Ring turned to Bart, apology and chagrin in his eyes. Look, I never meant to get in the bald one down on us, he said, but Bart kept his face resolutely averted. It was easier this way, without pretense of friendship. The light from the small captive sun grew more intense. Bart had never known anything like it, and was glad to slip away and put the dark contact lenses into his eyes. They made his eyes appear all enormous, dilated pupils. Fearfully, he hoped no one would notice. His arms smarted, and he did not speak to Ring all through the long, slow deceleration. When the intercom ordered all crew members to the hatchway, Bart lingered a minute, pinning the yellow radiation badge in a fold in his cloak. A spasm of fear threatened to overwhelm him again, and nightmarish loneliness. He felt agonizingly homesick for his own familiar face. It seemed almost more than he could manage to step out into the corridor full of Lhari. It won't be long now. The hatch opened. Even accustomed as he was to Lhari lights, Bart squeezed his eyes shut at the blue-white brilliance that assaulted him now. Then, opening slitted lids cautiously, he found that he could see. A weirdly desolate scene stretched away before them. Bare, burning sand, strewn with curiously colored rocks, lay piled in strange chaos. Then he realized there was an odd but perceptible geometry to their arrangement. They showed alternate crystal and opaque faces. Old Rugal noted his look of surprise. Never been here before? That's right. You've always worked on the Polaris run. Well, those aren't true rocks, but living creatures of a sort. The crystals are living. The opaque faces are lichens that have something like chlorophyll and can make their food from air and sunlight. The rocks and lichens live in symbiosis. They have intelligence of a sort, but fortunately they don't mind us or our automatic mining machinery. Every time, though, we find some new lichen that's trying to set up a symbiotic cycle with the concrete of our bunkers. And every time, Ring said cheerfully, somebody, usually me, has to see about having them scraped down and repainted. Maybe someday I'll find a paint the lichens don't like the taste of. Going to explore with Ring? Rugal asked, and Ring, always ready to let bygones be bygones, grinned and said, Sure. Bart could not face him. Barngle stopped and said, This your first time here, young Bartol. How would you like to visit the monument with me? You can see the machinery on the way back. Relieved at not having to go with Ring, he followed the captain, falling into step beside him. They moved in silence along the smooth stone path. The crystal creatures made this road, Varingal said at last. I think they read minds a little. There used to be a very messy, rocky desert here, and we used to have to scrabble and scratch our way to the monument. Then one day a ship, not mine, touched down and discovered that there was a beautiful smooth road leading up to the monument, and the lichens never touched that stone. But you probably had all this in school. Excited, Bartol? No, sir. Why? Eyes look a bit odd, but who could blame you for being excited? I never come here without remembering Razon and his crew on that long jump. The longest any Lhari captain ever made. A blind leap in the dark. Remember, Bartol? Through the dark, through the void, with his own crew cursing him for taking the chance. No one had ever crossed between galaxies. And remember, they were using the ancient math. He paused, and Bart said through a catch of breath, Quite an achievement. His badge still looked reassuringly yellow. You young people have no sense of wonder, Varingal said. Not that I blame you. You can't realize what it was like in those days. Oh, we'd had star travel for centuries. We were beginning to stagnate. And now look at us. Oh, they derided Razon. Said that even if he did find anyone, any other race, they'd be monsters with whom we could never communicate. But here we have a whole new galaxy for peaceful trade, a new mathematics that takes all the hazard out of space travel. Our Mentorian friends and allies. He smiled. Don't tell the High Council on me, but I think they deserve a lot more credit than most Lhari care to give them. Between ourselves, I think the next Panarch may see it that way. Varingo paused. Here's the monument. It lay between the crystal columns, tall, of pale blue sandstone, with letters in deep shadow of such contrast that the Lhari could read them, a high, sheer, imposing stele. Vorongil read the words slowly aloud in the musical Lhari language. Here, with thanks to those who watch the great night, I, Razon of Nedran, raise a stone of memory. Here we first do touch the new worlds. Let us never again fear to face the unknown, trusting that the mind of all knowledge still has many surprises in store for all the living. I think I admire courage more than anything there is, Bartol. Who else could have dared it? Doesn't it make you proud to be a Lhari? Bart had felt profoundly moved. Now he snapped back to awareness of who he was and what he was doing. So only the Lhari had courage. Life has surprises, all right, Captain, he thought grimly. He glanced down at the badge strip of plastic on his arm. It began to tinge a faint orange as he looked, and a chill of fear went over him. He had to get away somehow, get to cover. He looked round, and his fear was almost driven from his mind. Captain, the rocks, they're moving, Vorongil said, unruffled. Why, so they are. They do, you know. They have intelligence of a sort, though I've never actually seen them move before. I know they shift places overnight. I wonder what's going on. They were edging back, the path widening and changing. Oh, well, maybe they're going to do some more landscaping for us. I once saw a captain who swore they could read his mind. Bart saw the slow, inexorable deepening of his badge. He had to get away. He tensed, impatient, gripped by fists of panic. Somewhere on this world, Montano and his men were setting up their lethal radiations. Think of this. A Lhari ship of our own to study, to know how it works, to see the catalyst and find out where it comes from, to read their records and star routes. Now we know we can use it without dying in the warp drive. Think of this. To be human again, yet to travel the stars with men of my own race. It's worth a few deaths. Even Vorongil, standing here talking to him, he might say it. You talk to him as if he'd been your father. Oh, Dad, what would you have done? His voice was steady as he said, It's very good of you to show me all this, sir, but the other men will call me a slacker. Hadn't I better get to a work detail? Maybe so, Feathertop, Vorongil said. Let me see. Well, down this way is the last row of bunkers. See the humps? You can check inside to see if they're full or empty, and save us the trouble of exploring if they're all empty. Have a look around inside if you care to. The robot machinery's interesting. Bart tensed. He had wondered how he'd get hidden inside, but he asked, Not locked? Locked? The old Lhari's short, yellowed crest bobbed in surprise. Why? Who ever comes here but our ships? And what could we do with the stuff but take it back with us? Why locked? You've been on the drift too long, among those thieving humans. It's time you got back to live among decent folk. Well, go along. The sting of the words stiffened Bart as he took his leave. The color of the badge seemed deeper orange. When it's red, you're dead. It's true, the Lhari don't steal. They don't even seem to understand dishonesty. But they lied. Lied to us all. Knowing what we were like, maybe. That we'd steal their ships, their secrets, their lives. The deepening color of the badge seemed the one visible thing in a strange, glaring world. He walked along the row of bunkers, realizing he need not check if they were full or empty. Lhari wouldn't live long enough to harvest their better-than-graphite lubricant. They'd be dead. The last bunker was empty. He looked at his orange badge and stepped inside, heart pounding so loudly he thought it was an external sound. It was an external sound. A step. "Don't move 1 inch," said a voice in Universal, and Bart froze, trembling. He looked cautiously round. Montano stood there, space-suited, his head bare, dark contact lenses blurring his eyes, and in his hand a drawn blaster was held level, trained straight at Bart's heart. End of chapter 11. Okay, so chapter 11, and Bart is back on the ship, and he is going back between feeling uneasy and uncomfortable with assisting in the murder of this whole crew, and with being like, you know what, and rationalizing how it's okay. And so he does end up like sabotaging the radiation detection panel. And he has this little like slip that he got from Montano that when it's yellow, it's fine. When it's orange, it's starting to get radiation and you need to start moving. And then when it's red, it is like high radiation and everybody will die. So that's the like little paper that he's checking, and it does get to an orange, and so he's like starting to freak out a little bit. He gets off, he deplanes with the captain, and they walk to the memorial, and him and the captain are just talking, chatting, a little bit fatherly, father-sonly, I guess, and just talking about the monument. And aren't you proud to be part of, the Lhari race? And aren't you like proud for all of these things? And of course nothing is locked, because why would there be? We're the only ones who ever come here. We're not like humans who would obviously steal everything. And so like that like also is in Bart's mind, like, oh yeah, like they don't understand like dishonesty, like they just can't at all understand it, but they know that humans are dishonest, And let's see. Oh, and I forgot a part where Ring is like going through and inspecting everything, and he does notice the panel, and so he's trying to figure out like who did the panel and everything like that, and it comes to Bart, and they're like, hey Bart, you're the one who like was on shift by yourself, like was it you? And so Bart and Ring get into like this little like claw fight with their long extended creepy nails, and they scratch each other, and the captain comes in and like has had it, and he's like, you need to stop, like we're part of a family, blah blah blah. When one person's upset, we're all upset, all of these things, like it's a whole world. And at the very end of the chapter, Bart is by himself looking through like these little like heaps to see if they're empty or if there's anything in it. And he hears like somebody behind him, and it's Montano, and Montano is pointing a blaster right at him. Bum bum bum. All right. Chapter 12. After the first moment of panic, Bart realized Montano could not tell him from a Lhari. He remained motionless. "It's me, Montano. Bart Steele." The man lowered the weapon and put it away. "You nearly got yourself cut down," he said. "Did you make it all right?" He crossed behind Bart, inspecting the fastening of the bunker. "It's just the luck I didn't shoot you first and ask questions afterward." Montano drew a deep breath and sat down on the concrete floor. "Anyway, we're safe in here. You've got about half an hour before the radiation will reach lethal intensity. It has a very short half-life, though. Only about 12 minutes. If we spend an hour in here, we'll be safe enough. Did you have any trouble putting the radiation counter out of commission?" So in half an hour, they would all be dead. Ring, Bruegel, Captain Vorengil, 24 Lhari, all dead, so that Montano could have a Lhari ship to play with. And then what? More killing? More murder? Would Montano start killing everyone who tried to get the secret of the drive from him? The Lhari had the star drive. Maybe it belonged to them. Maybe not. Maybe humans had a right to have it, too. But this wasn't the right way. Maybe they didn't deserve it. He looked to Montano. He turned to look at Montano. The man was leaning back, whistling softly through his teeth. He felt like telling Montano that he wouldn't go through with it. He started to speak, then stopped, his blood icing over him. If I try to argue with him, I'll never get out of here alive. It means too much to him. Do I just salve my conscience with that, then? Sit here and let them die? With a shock of remembrance, it came to Bart that he had a weapon. He was armed, this time, with the ergon beam that was part of his uniform. Montano had evidently forgotten it. Could he kill Montano, even to save 24 Lhari? He reached hesitantly toward the beam gun, quickly thumbed the catch down to the lowest point, which was a simple shock. He froze as Montano looked in his direction, hand out of sight under his cloak. How many Lhari on board? 23, and 3 Mentorians. Anyone apt to be behind shielding, say in the drive chamber? No, I think they're all outside. Montano nodded, idly. Then we won't have to worry. Bart slipped his hand toward his weapon. Montano saw the movement, cocked his head in question. Then, as understanding flashed over his face, his hand darted to his own gun. But Bart had pressed the charge of this, and Montano slumped over without a cry. He looked so limp that Bart gasped. Was he dead? Hastily, he fumbled the lax hand for a pulse. After a long, endless moment, he saw Montano's chest twitch and knew the man was breathing. Well, Montano would be safe here in the bunker. Hastily, Bart looked at his timepiece. Half an hour before the radiation was lethal. For the Lhari. Was it already for him? Shakily, he unfastened the door. He ran out into the glare, seeing as he ran that his badge was tinged with an ever-darkening gold. Orange. Montano had said there was a safety margin. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe all Bart would accomplish would be his own death. He ran back along the line of bunkers, his heart pounding with his feet racing. 2 crewmen came along the line, young, white-crested Lhari from the other watch. He gasped. Where's the captain? Down that way. What's wrong, Bartol? But Bart was gone, his muscles aching with the unaccustomed effort inside gravity. Putting on speed, he saw the tall, austere shape of Varangel, his banded cloak dark against the glaring light. Varangel turned, startled at the sound of his running feet. Suddenly, Bart realized that he was still holding his energon ray. In shock and revulsion, he dropped it at Varangel's feet. Captain, go warn the men. They'll all be dead in half an hour. There are lethal radiations. What? Are you sunstruck? Bart stopped cold. Never once had it crossed his mind what he would say to Varangel, or how he would make the captain believe his story without revealing Montano. He started to hold up his badge, realized the Lhari captain could not see color, and dropped it again, while Varangel bent over to pick up the fallen gun. Are you sunstruck or mad, Bartol? What's this babble? Captain, everybody on the Swiftwing, and speak Lhari, Varangel demanded, and Bart realized that in his excitement he had been shouting in Universal. He drew a long, deep breath. Captain, there are lethal radiations being released here, he said. You have just barely half an hour to gather all the men and get them behind shielding. The radiation counter is out of order, Varangel remarked, unruffled. How can you possibly know? Bart stood in despair. Could he say, "A ship has landed here"? Could he say, "Check that bunker"? Even if Montano was a would-be murderer, he was human, and Bart could not betray him to the Lhari. There had been too much betrayal. His voice rose in sudden hysteria. "Captain, there's no time. I tell you, you'll all be dead if you don't believe me. Get the men into the ship, get them behind shielding, and then check my story. I'm not..." He had gotten this far. He might as well go all the way. "I'm not a Lhari." "What?" One of the crewmen came dashing up, his crest sweat-streaked. "Captain, Rugal has collapsed. We don't know what's wrong with him." "Radiation sickness," said Bart, and Varangul reached out, catching his shoulder in a cruel, taloned grip. Bart said desperately, "I'm not a Lhari. I signed on in disguise. I knew they meant to take the ship, but I can't let you all die." "How can I make you believe me? Here." In desperation, Bart reached up. Pain stabbed his eyeballs, fierce, blinding, as he pulled out one of the contact lenses. He could not see the captain's face through the light, but suddenly 2 Lhari were holding his arms. The fear of death was on Bart, but it no longer mattered. He saw through watering eyes, the ever-deepening orange of the badge disappearing. "Here," he said, tearing at it. "Radiation. You must be able to see how dark it is, even if it's just darkness." Suddenly Varangil was shouting, but Bart could not hear. 2 men were dragging him along. They hustled him up the ramp of the ship. He could see again, but his eyes were blurred, and he felt sick. Colors spinning before his eyes, a nauseated ringing in his head. At first, he thought it was his ears ringing, and then he made out the rising, shrieking wail and fall of the emergency siren, steps running, shouting voices, the low clang of the doors. Someone was pushing at him, babbling words in Lhari, but he heard them through an ever-increasing distance. Varangul's face bent over his, only a blurred crimson blob that flashed away like a vanishing star in the viewport. It flamed out into green darkness, vanished, and Bart fell through what seemed to be a bottomless chasm of starless night. When he woke, acceleration had its crushing hand on his chest. He tried to move, discovered that he was strapped hard into a bunker, and fainted again. Suddenly the pressure was gone, and he was lying at ease on the smooth sheets of a hospital bunk. His eyes were covered with a light bandage, and there was a sharp pain in his left arm. He tried to move it, and found it was tied down. "I think he's coming round," said Varangul's voice. "Yes, and a lot too soon for me," said a bitter voice which Bart recognized as that of the ship's medic. "Freak." "Listen, Baldy," said Varangul. "Whoever he is, he could have been blinded or killed. You wouldn't be alive now if it wasn't for that freak, as you call him. Bartle, can you hear me? How much light can your eyes stand?" "As much as any Mentorian." Bart found he could move his right arm, and twitched the bandage away. Varangul and the medic stood over him. In the other infirmary bunk, a form was lying, covered with a white sheet. Sickly, Bart wondered if they had found Montano. Varangul followed the direction of his eyes. "Yes," he said, and his voice held deep bitterness. "Poor old Rugal is dead. He didn't get much of the radiation, but his heart wouldn't stand it and gave out." He bowed his head. "He was bald in the service of the ships when my crest was new sprouted," he said, in deep grief. Bart felt the shock of that, even through his own fear. He looked down at his left arm. It was strapped to a splint, and fluid was dripping slowly into the vein there. Varangul nodded. "I expect you feel pretty sick. You got a good dose of radiation yourself, but we've given you a couple of transfusions. One of the Mentorian matched your blood type, fortunately. It was a close call. The medic looking down in ill-disguised curiosity. Fantastic, he said. I don't suppose you'd tell me who changed your looks. I admit I wouldn't believe it until I had a look at your foot bones under the fluoroscope. Voragil said quietly. Bartle, I don't suppose that's your real name. Why did you do it? I couldn't see you all die, sir, Bart said, not expecting them to believe him. No more than that. The medic said roughly in Lhari. It's a trick, sir, no more. A trick to make us trust him. Why would he risk his own life, then? Voragil said. No, it's more than that. He hesitated. We checked the bunkers, in radiation suits, before we took off. We found a man in one of them. Was he dead? Bart whispered. No, Voragil said, quietly. Thank God. It was a heartfelt explosion. Then, apprehensively. Or did you kill him? What do you think we are? Voragil said incredulously. Indeed, no. His own men have probably found him by now. I don't imagine he got half as much radiation as you did. Bart surveyed the needle in his arm. Why are you taking all this trouble if I'm going to be put out of the way? You must have some funny ideas about us, Voragil said, shaking his head. That would be a fine way to reward you for saving all of our lives. No, you're not going to be killed. If I had my way, the old medic began, and suddenly Voragil flew into a rage. Get out! The medic went stiffly through the door, and Voragil stood gazing down at Bart, shaking his yellowed crest. I don't know what to say to you. It was a brave thing you did, but perhaps no braver than you've done all along. Are you a Mentorian? Only half. Strange, Voragil said, looking into space, that I could talk to you as I did by the monument, and you knew what I meant. But yes, you would understand. Abruptly, he recalled himself, and his voice was thin and cold. I haven't quite decided what to do. I haven't spoken of this to the crew yet. The fewer who know about this, the better. I told them you got a heavy dose of radiation and you're too sick to see visitors. He sounded kinder when he said it. It's true, you know. It won't hurt you to get your strength back. He went out, and Bart wondered, get my strength back for what? He lay back, feeling weaker than he realized. It was a relief to know he wasn't going to be killed out of hand. And somehow, he didn't believe he was going to be killed at all. It wasn't like being a prisoner. The medic brought him plenty of food, urging him to eat. You need plenty of protein after radiation burns. And if he stayed in the bunk, it was only because he felt too weak to get up. Actually, he was suffering from a delayed emotional shock, as well as from radiation. He was content to let things drift. Inevitably, the time came when he had to think about what he had done. He had betrayed Montano. He had been false to the men who sent him. But they don't know the Lhari, his conscience replied, justifying what he had done. You sided with the Lhari against your own people. You spoiled our chances of learning about the Lhari fuel catalyst. I've done something better than stealing a secret by stealth. I've proved that humans and Lhari can communicate, that they can trust each other. It's only their looks that are strange. A kind, generous man is a kind, generous man, whether his name is Raynor III or Voragil. But who's going to know? I know it. And truth comes out sooner or later. Somehow a better understanding between man and Lhari will come of this. Secure in the knowledge, he turned over and went peacefully to sleep. When he woke again, he felt better. The Mentorian girl, Meta, was sitting quietly between the bunks, watching him. He started to turn over, flinched, at the pain in his arm. "Yes," she said. We're giving you one last transfusion. Plasma, this time. It's Lhari, but if you know that much, you know it won't hurt you." She came and inspected the needle in his wrist, and Bart caught her hand in his free one. "Meta, does anyone else know?" She looked down with a troubled smile. "I don't think so. I was off watch, waiting for cold sleep. We're just about to make the long jump, when Varangil came to my quarters. I was startled, almost out of my wits. He asked if I could keep a secret. Then he told me about you." "Oh, Bart." Her soft, small hand closed convulsively on his. "I was so afraid. I knew they wouldn't kill you, but I was afraid." Yet they had killed David Briscoe, Bart thought, and hunted down 2 of his friends. It was the only thing he couldn't square with his perception of the Lhari. It didn't fit. He could understand that they had shot down the robot cab with Edmund Briscoe in it, in pure self-defense, and that knowledge had taken off the edge of the horror. But the death of young Briscoe and everyone he had talked to could not be explained away. "You seem very sure they wouldn't have killed me, Meta," he said carefully, clasping his hand around hers. "They wouldn't," she affirmed, "but they could make you forget." A small chill went over Bart. He let go of her hand and lay staring bleakly at the wall. He supposed that was his probable fate, remembering the tragic tone of Raynor 3 when he said, "I won't remember you." He gritted his teeth, feeling his face twist convulsively. Meta, watching, understood. "Arm hurting? I have that needle out of your vein in a few minutes now." When she had freed his arm and put away the apparatus, she came to his side. "Bart, how did it happen? How did they find you out?" Suddenly, the longing for human contact was too much for Bart, and the knowledge of his secret intolerable. The Lhari could find out what he knew, if they wanted to know, very simply. He was in their power. It didn't matter anymore. The telling of the story took a long time, and when he finished, Meta's small, soft kitten face was compassionate. "I'm glad you decided what you did," she whispered. "It's what a Mentorian would have done. I know that other races call us slaves of the Lhari. We aren't. We're working in our own way to show the Lhari that human beings can be trusted. The other peoples, they hold away from the Lhari, fighting them with words even though they're afraid to fight them with weapons, carrying on the war that they're afraid to fight. Did it ever occur to you? All the peoples of all the planets keep saying, 'We're as good as the Lhari,' but only the Mentorians are willing to prove it. Bart, a Lhari ship can't get along in our galaxy without Mentorians anymore. It may be slower than trying to take the warp drive by force or stealing it by spying, but when we learn to endure it, I have faith that we'll get it." Bart, although moved by Meta's philosophy, couldn't quite share it. It still seemed to him that the Mentorians were lacking in something. Independence, maybe, or drive. "I wasn't thinking about anything like that," he said honestly. "It was simply that I couldn't let them die. After all," he was speaking more to himself than the girl, "it's their star drive. They found it, and they've given us star trade and star travel, cheaply and with profit to both sides. I hope we'll get the star drive someday. But if we got it by mass murder, it would sow the seeds of a hatred between men and Lhari that would never end. It wouldn't be worth it, Meta. Nothing would be worth that. We've got enough hate already." Bart was still in his bunk, but beginning to fret at staying there, when the familiar trembling of acceleration 2 started to run through the ship. It was, by now, so familiar to him that he hardly gave it a second thought. But Meta panicked. What's happening? Bart, what is it? Why are we under acceleration again? Shift to warp, he said without thinking, and her face went deathly white. So that's it, she whispered. Varango. No wonder he wasn't worried about what I would find out from you, or what you knew. She drew herself together in a chair, a miserable, shrunken, terrified little figure, bravely trying to control her terror. Then she held out her hands to Bart. I'm ashamed, she whispered. When you've been so brave, I shouldn't be afraid to die. Meta, what's the matter? What are you afraid of? It suddenly swept over Bart what she meant and what she feared. But don't you understand, Meta? He exclaimed. Humans can live through the warp drive. No drugs, no cold sleep. Meta, I've done it dozens of times. But you're a Lhari. It burst from her, uncontrollable. She stopped, looked at him in consternation. He smiled, bitterly. No, Meta. They didn't do a thing to my internal organs, to my brain, to the tissues of my body, just a little plastic surgery on my hands, my feet, and my face. Meta, there's nothing to be afraid of. Nothing, he repeated. She twisted her small hands together. I'm trying to believe that, she whispered. But all my life I've known. The screaming whine in the ship gripped them with the strange, clawing lassitude and discomfort. Bart, gasping under it, heard the girl moan, saw her slump lax in her chair, half fainting. Her face was so deathly white that he began seriously to be afraid she would die of her fear. Fighting his own agonizing weakness, he pulled himself upright. He reached the girl, dug his claws cruelly into her. Girl, get a hold of yourself. Fight it. Fight it. The more scared you are, the worse it's going to be. She was rigid, trembling in a trance of terror. You rotten little coward, he yelled at her. Snap out of it, or are all you Mentorians so gutless that you believe any half-baked folktale the Lhari pass off on you? You and your fine talk about earning the star drive. What would you do with it after you got it if you die of fear when you try? Oh, you... She flung her head back, her eyes blazing with rage. Anything you can do, I can do too. He saw life flowing back into her face, and the trembling, now with fury, not fear. She was fighting the pain, the crawling itch in her nerve endings, the terrible sense of draining disorganization. Bart felt his hold on himself breaking. He whispered hoarsely, "That's the girl. Don't be scared if I black out for a minute." He held on to consciousness with his last courage, afraid if he fainted, the girl would collapse again. She reached for him, and Bart, starved for some human touch, drew her into his arms. They clung together, and he felt her wet face against his own, the softness of her trembling hands. She was still crying a little. Then the blackness closed on him, as if endless, and the gray blur of warp drive peak blotted his brain into nothingness. He came out of it to feel her cheek soft against his, her head trustfully on his shoulder. He said huskily, "All right, Meta?" "I'm fine," she murmured shakily. He tightened his hands a little, realizing that for the first time in months he had physically forgotten his Lhari disguise, that Meta had given him this priceless reassurance that he was human. But, as if suddenly aware of it again, she looked up at him and drew hesitantly away. "Don't, Meta, am I so horrible to you then? So repulsive?" No, it's only..." She bit her lip. "It's just that the Lhari are... I can't quite explain it. Different, Bart finished for her. At first I was repelled, physically repelled by myself and by them. It was like living among weird animals and being one of the animals. And then, one day, Ring was just another kid. He had gray skin and long claws and white hair, just the way I once had pinkish skin and short fingernails and reddish hair. But the difference wasn't that I was human inside and he wasn't. If you skinned Ring and skinned me, we'd be almost identical. And all of a sudden then, Ring and Varangil and all the rest were men to me, just people. I thought you Mentorians, after living with the Lhari all these years, would feel that. She said in a slow wonder, "We've lived and worked side by side with them all these years, yet kept so apart. I've defended the Lhari to you, yet it took you to explain them to me." His arm was still round her head still lying on his shoulder. Bart was just beginning to wonder if he might kiss her when the infirmary door opened, and Ring stood in the doorway staring at them with surprise, shock, and revulsion. Bart realized suddenly how it must look to Ring, who certainly shared Meta's prejudice. But even as he comprehended it, Ring's face altered. Meta slipped from Bart's arms and rose, but Ring came slowly a step into the room. "I remembered you had a bad reaction to warp drive," he said. "I came to see if you were all right. I would never have believed, but I'm beginning to guess. There was always something about you, Bartol." He shut the door behind him and stood against it. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. He said, "You're not Lhari, are you?" "Varangil knows," Bart said. Ring nodded. "That day on Lharilis, the crew was talking, but only one or two of them really know what happened. There are a dozen rumors. I wanted to see you. They said you were sick with radiation burns." "I was." Ring raised his hand absently to the still puckered mark on his cheek, saw Bart watching him, and smiled. "You're not worrying about that fight? Forget it, friend. If anything, I admire someone who can use his claws, especially if, as I begin to suspect, they're not his." He leaned over, his hand lightly on Bart's shoulder. "I don't forget so easily. You saved my life, remember? And you're a hero on the ship for warning us all. Are you really human? Why not get rid of the disguise?" Bart laughed wryly. "It won't come off," he said, and explained. Ring raised his hands to his own face curiously. "I wonder what sort of human I'd make." He looked at Meta's small fingers. "Not that I'd ever have the nerve, but then it's no surprise to anyone that you have courage, Bartol." "You seem to accept it." "It's a shock," said Ring honestly. "It scares me a little, but I'm remembering the friendship. That was real. As far as I'm concerned, it still is real." Aww. End of chapter 12. All right, chapter 12. Bart decides he is going to save the Lhari. Like, he can't have Montana. He can't have Hannah Montana just kill all of the Lhari that he's built, like, a relationship with, and he's now understanding aren't the monsters that everybody else thinks that they are. And so he shocks Montano and runs to the captain and is like, "Captain, you have to get everybody back on ship and you have to go back to the shielding. There is radiation and it will kill everybody. We only have like 30 minutes to do this." And the captain is like asking questions like, "Well, like, how do you know this?" And Bart comes to the realization that he didn't think about what he was actually going to say to the captain. And he's like, "Oh, oopsie doodle, guess I have to reveal." And he's like, "I'm not Lhari." So he says that he's not Lhari, and the captain, like, we're getting like flashes almost because Bart is starting to get radiation poisoning. So we're only hearing like flashes of what Captain Varangil is saying, but he is gathering everybody, and then Bart, like, wakes up in a hospital wing, like, a little bit later, and they are traveling. And he wakes up, and Varangil is there with a medic, and the medic is taking care of him, but grudgingly so because Bart has lied to them, and Varangil is like, you shut your mouth, you medic, because of Bart, we are alive. They're calling him Bartol because that's the name that the Lhari name that he has. He's like, because of him, we are alive. Like, if it wasn't for him, we would all have died. Blah blah blah. He changed his mind. He's my man. And they're keeping it under wraps, so not all of the crew knows. Meta does know, and they have this, Bart and Meta have this moment where it's like, I'm human, and like, if you skin both me and Ring, you won't be able to tell the difference between us. Like, we're all the same type of a thing. Like, we're just people, humans, like, whatever the usage they said. Like, there's no real difference. The only difference is in how we look. And then Meta is like, oh, you're right. And they, like, almost kiss, and then Ring comes in. Oh, I forgot. They're going into warp drive, and Meta is like super scared because she's been living like everybody else. She's been living thinking that the only people who can handle warp drive are Lhari, so she thinks that she's going to die. And Bart is like a little harsh and is like, you moron, you're not gonna die. Snap out of it. You'll be fine. Like, if you think that you're gonna get the warp drive, like, how do you think you're gonna use it if you're gonna die? Whatever. It's a little aggressive, I think. Especially for somebody who their whole life thought that they were going to die if they weren't in deep sleep during this, but neither here nor there. And then Ring comes in and was like, you're not Lhari, are you? Like, I've sort of guessed that this is the case. There are like rumors going around of what's actually happened, but nobody really knows the story. I just wanted to come and see you. I heard that you were sick, and I have not forgotten our friendship. Our friendship is real, no matter what you are. And that is where the chapter ended. But Rugal did die because of radiation. I forgot that. Rugal did die, which is sad. But Rugal was also he was older, and he did have a hard time with like warp speed anyway. Like, he passed out and couldn't do it. And it was like, oh, this guy, we all know that he has a hard time with it, and we just accept it. So Rugal was old, and he just got too much radiation. Uh-ohs. Uh-ohs. But it was just one person instead of literally everybody on the ship, so that's good news, and it was accidental. Chapter 13. Ring was still bending over Meta's hand when Varangil came into the cabin. He started to speak, then noticed Ring. I might have known, he growled. If there was anyone to find out, you'd find it. If there was anything to find out, you'd find it. Shall I go? Ryoko Mori? No, stay. You'll find it out some way or other. You might as well get it right the first time. But first of all, are you all right, Meta? Her chin went up defiantly. Yes. And why have you lied to us all these years? All of you. Varangil looked mildly startled. It wasn't exactly a lie. 9 out of 10 Lhari captains believe it with all their heart. That humans die in warp drive. I wasn't sure myself until I heard the debates in Council City last year. But why? Varangil sighed. His eyes rested disconcertingly on Bart. I presume you know human history, he said, better than I do. The Lhari have never had a war in all written history. Quite frankly, you terrified us. It was decided on the highest summit levels that we wouldn't give humans too many chances to find out things we preferred to keep to ourselves. The first few ships to carry Mentorians had carried them without cold sleep, but people forget easily. The truth is buried in the records of voyages, in the records of early voyages. As the Mentorians grew more important to us, we began to regret the policy, but by that time the Mentorians themselves believed it so firmly that when we tried the experiment of carrying them through the shift into warp drive, they died of fear. Pure suggestion. I tried it with you, Meta, because I knew Bart's presence would reassure you. The others were given an inert sedative they believed to be the cold sleep drug. How are you feeling, Bart? Fine, but wondering what's going to happen. You won't be hurt, Vorongil said, quickly. Then, you don't believe me, do you? I don't, sir. David Briscoe did what I did, and he's dead. So are 3 other men. Men do strange things from fear. Men and Lhari. Your people, as I said before, have a strange history. It scares us. Can you guarantee that some, at least, of your people wouldn't try to come and take the star drive by force? We left a man on Lharilis who thought nothing of killing 24 of us. I suppose the captain of the multiphase, knowing he had gravely violated Lhari laws, knowing that Briscoe's report might touch off an intergalactic war between men and Lhari, well, I suppose he felt that half a dozen deaths were better than 500,000. I'm not defending him, just explaining, maybe, why he did what he did. Bart lowered his eyes. He had no answer to that. No, you won't be killed, but that's all I can guarantee. My personal feelings have nothing to do with it. You'll have to go to Council Planet with us, and you'll have to be psych-checked there. That is Lhari law, and by treaty with your Federation it is human law, too. If you know anything dangerous to us, we have a legal right to eliminate those memories before you can be released. Meta smiled at him encouragingly, but Bart shivered. That was almost worse than the thought of death. And the fear grew more oppressive as the ship forged onward toward the home world of the Lhari. And it did not lessen when, after they touched down, he was taken from the ship under guard. He had only a glimpse through dark glasses of the terrible brilliance of the Lhari sun dazzling on crystal towers, before he was hustled into a closed surface car. It whisked him away to a building he did not see from the outside. He was taken up by private elevator to a suite of rooms which might, for all he could tell, have been a suite in a luxury hotel or a lunatic asylum. The walls were translucent, the furniture oddly colored, and so carefully padded that even a homicidal or suicidal person could not have hurt himself or anyone else on it or with it. Food reached him often enough so that he never got hungry, but not often enough to keep him from being bored between meals or from brooding. 2 enormous Lhari came in to look at him every hour or so, but either they were deaf and dumb, did not understand his dialect of Lhari, or were under orders not to speak to him. It was the most frustrating time of his entire voyage. One day, it ended. A Lhari and a Mentorian man came for him and took him down elevators and upstairs and into a quiet, neutral room where 4 Lhari were gathered. They sat him in a comfortable chair, and the Mentorian interpreter said gently, with apology, "Bart Steele, I have been asked to say to you that you will not be physically harmed in any way. This will be much simpler and will have much less injurious effect on your mind if you cooperate with us. At the same time, I have been asked to remind you that resistance is absolutely useless, and if you attempt it, you will only be treated with force rather than with courtesy." Bart sat facing them, shaking with humiliation. The thought of resistance flashed through his mind. Maybe he should make them fight for what they got. At least they see that all humans weren't like Mentorians, to sit quietly and let themselves be brainwashed without a word of protest. He started to spring up, and the hands of his guards tightened, swift and strong, even before his muscles had fully tightened. Bart's head dropped. Cold, common sense doused over his brave thoughts. He was uncountable millions of light years from his own people. He was absolutely alone. Bravery would mean nothing. Submission would mean nothing. Would he be more of a man, somehow, if he let his mind be wrecked? "All right," he muttered. "I won't fight." "You show your good sense," the Mentorian said quietly. "Give me your left arm, please. Or, if you are left-handed, your right, as you prefer." Deftly, almost painlessly, a needle slid into his arm, giving in. A dizzying welter of thoughts spun suddenly in his mind. Briscoe, Raynor 1 and Raynor 3, the net between the stars, Ring, Varangil, Meta, his father. Consciousness slid away. Years later, he never knew whether it was memory or imagination. It seemed to him that he could reach into that patch of gray and dreamless time and fish out questions and answers whole, the faces of Lhari swelling up suddenly in his eyes and shrinking back into interstellar distance, the sting smell of drugs, the sound of unexpected voices, odd reflex pains, cobwebs of patchy memories that fitted nowhere else into his life, so that he supposed they must go here. He only knew that there was a time he did not remember, and then a time when he began to think there was such a thing as memory, and then a time when he floated without a body, and then another time when the patch of every separate nerve in his body seemed to be outlined, a shimmering web in the gray murk. There was a mirror and a face. There were blotchy worms of light like the star trails of peaking warp drive through the viewport, colors shifting and receding, a green star, the red eye of Antares. Then the peak point faded. His mind began to decelerate and angle slowly down and down into the field of awareness, and he became fuzzily aware that he was lying full length on a sort of couch. He shook his head groggily. It hurt. He sat up. That hurt, too. A hand closed gently around his elbow, and he felt the cold edge of a cup against his sore mouth. "Take a sip of this." The liquid felt cool on his tongue, evaporating almost before he could swallow. The fumes seemed to mount inside the root of his nose, expanding tremendously inside his head and brain. Abruptly, his head was clear, the last traces of gray fuzz gone. "When you feel able," the Mentorian said courteously, "the High Council will see you." Bart blinked, as if exploring a sore tooth with his tongue. His mind sought for memories, but they all seemed clear, marshaled in line. The details clear and unblurred on his voyage here, his humiliation and resentment against the Lhari. They could have changed my thinking, my attitudes. They could have made me admire or be loyal to the Lhari. They didn't. I'm still me. I'm ready now. He got up, reeled, and had to lean on the Mentorian. His feet did not seem to touch the ground in quite the right way. After a minute, he could walk steadily, and followed the Mentorian along a corridor. The Mentorian said in a small grill, "The vegan Bartol, alias Bart Steele." And after a moment, a doorway opened. Inside a room rose, high, domed, vaulted above his head, whitish opalescent, washed with green. For a moment, while his eyes adjusted to the light, he wondered how the Lhari saw it. Beyond an expanse of black, glassy floor, he saw a low semicircle table, behind which sat 8 Lhari. All wore pale robes with high collars that rose stiffly behind their domed heads. All were old, their faces lined with many wrinkles, and 7 of the 8 were as bald as the hull of the Swiftwing. Under their eyes, he hesitated. Then, unexpectedly, pride stiffened his back. They should have done a better job of brainwashing if they expected him to skulk in like a scared rabbit. He held his head high and moved across the floor step by steady step, trying not to limp or display that he felt tired or sore. You're human. Act proud of it. No one moved until he stood before the semicircle of ancients. Then the youngest, the only one of the 8 with some trace of feathery crest on his high gray forehead, said, "Captain Varangul, you identify this person?" "I do," Varangul said, and Bart saw him seated before the High Council. To Bart, the Lhari captain seemed a familiar, almost friendly face. "Well, Bart Steele, alias Bartol, son of Barahon," said one old Lhari. "What have you to say for yourself?" Bart stood silent, not moving. What could he say that would not reveal how desperately alone, how young and foolish and frightened he felt? All his brave resolutions seemed to drain away before their old, gnomish faces. Here he'd been thinking of himself as a brave spy, a gallant fighter in humanity's cause and whatnot. Now he saw himself for what he was, a reckless boy, meddling in affairs too big for him. He lowered his eyes. "We have read the transcript of your knowledge," said the old Lhari. "There is little in it that we do not know. We are not, of course, concerned with human conspiracies unless they endanger Lhari lives. The Antares authorities will deal with the man Montano for an unauthorized landing on Lharilis in violation of Federation treaty." He smiled, his gnome's face breaking into a million tiny cracks like a piece of gray-glazed pottery. "Bartol, or whatever you call yourself, you are a brave young man. I suppose you are afraid we will block your memories, or your ability to speak of them." Bart nodded, gulping. Did the old Lhari read his mind? "A year ago we might have done so, Captain Varangul. You will be interested to know that we have discussed this in council, and your recommendations have been taken. The secret that humans can endure star drive has outlived its usefulness. For good or ill, it is secret no longer. We cannot possibly eliminate all the old records or the enterprising people who hunt them out. The captain who had David Briscoe killed, under the mistaken notion that this would excuse his own negligence in letting Briscoe stow away on his ship, is undergoing psychotherapy and may eventually recover. As for the rest, Bart Steele, you know nothing that is a danger to us. You do not know the coordinates of our world or even in which galaxy it is located. You do not know where we secure the catalyst your people seek. In fact, you know nothing that is not soon to become common knowledge. In view of that, we have decided not to interfere with your memories." "Talk as you like," added another of the ancients, "and may your memories of this voyage help in understanding between the Lhari and other human races. Good fortune to you." And he was smiling. "There is another side to this," said a third, more sternly and gravely. "You have broken a treaty between Lhari and man. We have dealt with you as the laws required. Now your own people must do so. You must return to the Swiftwing, to the planet where the violation originated. He consulted a memorandum. Prycion Alpha. There you and the man Raynor 3 will face charges of unlawful conspiracy to board a Lhari ship in violation of intergalactic trade treaties. Captain Varangil, will you be responsible for him? So I've lost, Bart thought drearily. I didn't even learn anything important enough for them to suppress. There was a strange, wounded pride in this. After all his trouble, he was being treated like a little boy who has used a great deal of enterprise and intelligence to rob a cookie cupboard, and for his pains is sent home with the stolen cookie in his hand. Vorongil touched his arm. Come, Bartol, he said gently. I'm taking you back to the Swift Wing. I don't have to treat you like a prisoner, do I? Numbly, Bart gave what the old Lhari asked, his word of honor not to attempt escape. Escape? Where to? Or to attempt to enter the drive chamber of the Swiftwing while they were still among the Lhari worlds. As they left the council hall, Bart, in a gesture of despair, covered his face with his hands. As he brought them down, he found himself staring at them, transfixed. The fingers looked longer and thinner than he remembered them, but they were his own hands again. The nails seemed faintly thick and rigid, and there was still a faint grayish tinge through the pale flesh color, but they were human hands, unmistakably. He felt his nose and ears with fumbling fingers, raised his hand and touched the very short, crisp hair growing on his newly shaven skull. You fool, said Varangol to the Mentorian in disgust. Why didn't you tell him that the medics had done for him? Easy, Bartol. The old Lhari's arm tightened around his shoulder. I thought they'd told you. Somebody come here and give the youngster a hand. Later, in the small cabin, it had been Rugel's, which was to be his prison during the return voyage of the Swiftwing. He had a chance to study his familiar, strange face. He had thought that only a short time, an hour or so, had elapsed between the time he was drugged and the time they took him before the council. Later, from what he learned about the dispatch schedules of the Swiftwing, he realized that he had been kept under sedation for nearly 3 weeks, while his face and hands healed. As Raynor 3 had warned, the change was not altogether reversible. Studying his face in the mirror, he could still see a hint of something thin, strange, alien in the set of his features. The nose and chin somewhat too pointed, elfin, to be human. His hands would always be too long, too narrow, too supple. For the rest, he looked grim, older. He could never go back to what he had been before he became a Lhari. It had left its mark on him forever. Before the Swiftwing lifted, outbound, Vorongil came to his cabin. You've seen very little of our world, he said, diffidently. I have permission for you to visit the city before we leave Council Spaceport. You think you can trust me? Bart asked bitterly. Vorongil said gravely, without humor. The question does not arise. You do not know the coordinates of this world and have no way of finding them. Within those limitations, you are an honored guest here, and if it would give you any pleasure, you are welcome to see as much of Council Planet as time permits. It seemed, through Vorongil's kindness, that the old Lhari sensed his bitter defeat. Nothing was to be gained by sulking in his cabin, a prisoner. He had an opportunity which no human, except the Mentorians, had ever had, which perhaps no human would ever have again. He might as well take advantage of it. Ring and Meta both seemed startled at his new appearance, but Meta instantly held out her hands, clasping his quickly and warmly. Bart, I wondered what your face looked like, and I think I'd have known you anyhow. Ring surveyed him wonderingly, shaking his head. Say something. he implored, "so I know you're Bartol." Bart held out his arm, less gray by the day as the drug wore out of his system. The thin line of the scar was still on it. He raised his forefinger lightly to the first line on Ring's cheek. "I couldn't return that now, so let's not get into any more fights." Ring laughed and gave him a rough, affectionate shove. "You're Bartol, all right." Even his sense of defeat vanished in wonder as they came out into the great spaceport. He saw, now, that the Lhari spaceports in human worlds were built to create, for the spacemen, so far from their native worlds, some feeling of home. But everything here was so vast as to stagger the imagination. There were miles and miles of the great ships, lying strewn like pebbles on this monster beachhead into space, bearing the strangeness of a million far-flung stars. He gaped like a child. Above them, the burning brilliance of a star gave strange glow and color to the crystal pylons. What color was this star? He turned to Meta, irritated at his inability to be sure. "Meta, what color is this sun? I've been all around the spectrum, and it's not red, blue, green, orange, violet." He broke off, realizing what he said and what he had seen. "An eighth color," he finished anticlimactically. "You and your talk of colors," Ring grumbled. "I wish I knew what Mentorians see. It's like trying to imagine seeing a smell or hearing light." Meta laughed. "As far as I know, no one's named it. Sometimes we Mentorians call it catalyst color. I think only Mentorians can see it as separate color." "So what?" Ring said impatiently. "What are we going to do? Chatter about light waves or see the city?" Bart acquiesced, trying to sound eager, but a wild excitement was gusting up in him. He dutifully pretended fascination with the towers, the many leveled roads, the giant dams and pylons, but his thoughts were racing. The eighth color. There can't be too many suns of this color, or they'll have named it and known it, and telescopes can't find it. Could success be salvaged, then, at the very edge of failure? Maybe he need not go empty-handed, empty-eyed from the Lhari worlds. They had dismissed him, scornfully, stolen cookie in hand, but maybe it would be a bigger cookie than they dreamed. The exhilaration lasted through the tour of the port, through the heavy surge of acceleration which brought them up, out and away from Council Planet. Bart, confined in Rugel's cabin, hardly felt like a prisoner, his mind busy with schemes. "I'll study star maps and spectroscope reports." It lasted almost 2 days of ship time, and they were readying for acceleration 2 before he came, figuratively, down to Earth. To pick one star out of trillions, and not even in his own galaxy? It would take a lifetime, and he didn't even know which of the 4 or 5 spiral nebulae in the skies of the human worlds was the Lhari galaxy. A lifetime? 100 lifetimes wouldn't do it. He might have known. If there had been one chance in the odd billion of his making any such discovery, the Lhari would never have given Varangil permission for the intruder to visit the planet at all. He would have been returned to the Swiftwing as he had been taken from it, by closed car, and imprisoned, maybe even drugged, until he was safely back in the human worlds again. He was under parole not to enter the drive chamber, and sure he would be stopped if he attempted it anyhow. But when Acceleration 1 was completed, he went to the viewport in the recreation lounge, and nobody threw him out. He stood long, looking at the unfamiliar galaxy of the Lhari stars, the unknown, forever unknowable constellations with their strange shapes, stars green, gold, topaz, burning blue, sullen red, and the great, strangely colored receding sun of the Lhari people. known to them by the melodious name of the Key Lhari, which meant simply the sun. It was their first home. Where had he seen that color? In that stolen glimpse of the Lhari ship landing long ago, of all the colors of space, this one he would never know. He turned away from the unsolvable riddle of the strange constellations and went to his cabin to dream of the green star Meristem, where he had first plotted known coordinates for a previously unknown world, and to wander in baffling nightmares where he fed jagged, star-colored pieces of hail into the ship's computer and watched them come out as tiny paper doll spaceships with the letterhead of 8 colors printed neatly across their sides. After the warp drive shift, Varangul came to his cabin, this time crisp and businesslike. "We're back in your galaxy," he said, "among the stars you know. We have no passenger space on the Swiftwing. We had to ship out without replacing Rugal, which means we're short 2 men. I've no authority to ask this of you, but would you like your old job back for the rest of the voyage?" Bart glanced at his human hands. Varangil shrugged. "We've carried Mentorians as full-ranking astrogators. There don't happen to be any on the Swiftwing, but there's no law about it." Bart looked at the old Lhari in the eye. "I won't accept Mentorian terms, Varangil. I wouldn't ask it. You worked your way outward on this run, and the High Council didn't see fit to erase those memories or inhibit them. Why should I? Do you want or not?" Did he want it? Until this moment, Bart had not identified the worst of his pain and defeat: to travel as a passenger, a supercargo, when he had once been part of the Swiftwing. Literally, he ached to be back with it again. "I do. Rieko Mori." "Very well," Varangil rapped. "See that you turn out next watch." He spun round and walked out. His tone was no longer gently indulgent, but sharp and distant. Bart, at first surprised, suddenly understood. Not now a prisoner, a passenger, a guest on the Swiftwing. He was part of the crew again, and Varangil was his captain. The Lhari crew were oddly constrained at first, but Ring was the same as always, and before long they were almost on the old terms. With every watch, it seemed, he was building a bridge between man and Lhari. They accepted him. But for what? Something might come, in the far future, of his acceptance, but he wouldn't get the benefit of it. This would be his only voyage. After this, he'd be chained again, crawling from planet to planet of a single sun. And as warp shift followed warp shift, the Swiftwing, retracing the path of her outward cruise star by star, Bart said farewell to them. One day, at last, he stood at the viewport, watching Procyon Alpha nearing. A year ago, frightened, terribly alone, still unsteady on his new Lhari muscles, and terrified by the monsters that were his shipmates, he had watched these planets spinning away. Poor old Rugal. Poor old Baldy. Behind him, Meta came into the lounge. "Bart?" He turned to face her. "It won't be much longer, Meta. Tomorrow I'll be out what the Federation is going to do to me. Conspiracy unlawfully to board, and all the rest of it. Even if I don't go to a prison planet, I'll spend the rest of my life chained down to Vega." "Doesn't have to be that way." "What other choice is there?" he demanded. "You're half Mentorian," she said, raising her eager face. "Oh, Bart, you love it so. You know you can't bear to give it up. Stay with us. Please stay." Before answering, he looked out the viewport at a last time. The clouds of cosmic dust swirled and foamed around the familiar jewels of his own sky. Blue, beloved Vega, burning in the heart of the lyre. Home. When will he go home? He had no home now. Yet his father had left him Vega Interplanet, as well as 8 colors and a quest to the stars. He searched for the topaz of soul, where he had learned astrogation, Procyon, where he had become a Lhari, the ruby of Aldebaran, hail and farewell, David Briscoe, the bloodstone of Antares, where he had learned fear and the shape of integrity, the colors, the unknowable colors of space, and others. Nameless stars where he and his Lhari shipmates had worked and played, and stars he had never seen and would never see. All the endless worlds beyond worlds and stars beyond stars. He took a last, longing look at the colors of space, then turned his back on them, deliberately giving them up. He could not pay the price the Mentorians paid. No, Meta, he said huskily. The Mentorian way is one way, but I've had a taste of being one of the masters of space. It's more than most men ever have. Maybe it's more than I deserve. But I can't settle for anything less. Not even if it means losing you. He shut his eyes and stood, head bowed. When he looked up again, he was alone, with the stars beyond the viewport, and the lounge was empty. End of chapter 13. All right. Chapter 13. They said the thing! We need alarms to hop off when that happens. The titular line. Chapter 13, we have the aftermath. So Bart now has to go to the Lhari Council, and he's taken, and they, blindfold him, yada yada, all that thing, so that he can't really know anything or like see anything too much. And so he's in this like med bay for a while, and they drug him. But when he wakes up, he realizes that they didn't take his memory away, and they didn't like force any like persuasive thoughts on him. So all of his thoughts are his own, and everything that he remembers, at least as far as we know, are things that like nothing is missing. And so he goes in front of the council, and they've basically decided like nothing's gonna happen to you. Like, we're not gonna kill you. Like, none of those bad things. Um, like the secret of people outside of the Lhari, being able to survive warp speed, like it was gonna come out anyway. Like, we're not mad about that coming out. You haven't seen like anywhere of where our planets are. You have no idea where we're located. Any of that, you wouldn't be able to find us again. So it's fine. And Bart is like a little upset, a little miffed, if you will, because he thought that he was getting information, but the information that he like gathered wasn't so pivotal that the Lhari are like, no, you can't have that information. And he compares it to like stealing a cookie jar, and the punishment is like, all right, get out of here and take that cookie with you. So he's a little miffed about that. He's like, oh, I didn't even do what I was supposed to do, like figure anything out. And he oh, and the council is like, but you also did atrocities that aren't just Lhari based. So you're gonna have to also go back to Procyon and like face court there, you and Raynor 3, because you did some things that weren't great. So on the way back, he is like still a little sulking because he's like, I don't know anything, blah blah blah. And he has some restrictions, like he's not allowed to do certain things which would give away like where they are or anything like that. But about like halfway back, Varangel comes back and is like, okay, so we're like short 2 people. Do you want your job back? I understand if you don't want it, but do you want this? And Bart is like, Yeah, I do. And so he is now like a working part of the crew, and he's just thinking about what life is going to be like when he goes back home. Like, he's not going to be able to travel from galaxy to galaxy. He'll be able to travel through space, but all within his own star, and he's going to be sort of like shackled with the things that his father has set up for him. So he'll be working Vega Inner Planet, and he'll be working eight eight colors until the oh, there was one other thing. Nope, it's gone. And so like those things are things that are already set up for him. And he's like, you know what? Oh, and Meta is like, well, you don't have to do that. Like, you are part Mentorian. Like, you can just be part of these ships. Like, come with me and you'll see, it's pure imagination or whatever. And he's like, you know what? No, I've done a lot. Like, way more than any like human has been able to do before. And that's kind of cool. And that's where we are. And it really seems like, I mean, I guess we're gonna get what, yeah, we're gonna get when we're on Procyon Alpha, but like chapter 13 does a really good job of like almost wrapping everything up. But we do have one more chapter. We shall see. Oh, and he's back to being a human. When he was brought back onto the ship, he was like knocked out for several weeks, and they brought him back to being a human. But like Raynor 3 said, when they made him into a Lhari, it's not fully reversible. So there's like a couple things that are a little off, like in his hands. Like you can tell that they're like a little bit elongated, those sorts of things. But he's back to like mostly being how he was before. And his skin is like a little tinged with gray. All right. Last chapter. Chapter 14. The low rainbow building of 8 colors nears the spaceport of Procyon Alpha had not changed, and when Bart went in as he had done a year ago, it seemed that the same varnished girl was sitting before the same glass desk, neon-edged and brittle, with the same chrome-tinged hair and blue fingernails. She looked at Bart in his Lhari clothing, at Meta in her Mentorian robe and cloak, at Ring, and her unruffled dignity did not turn a hair. "May I help you?" she inquired, still not caring. "I want to see Raynor One." "On what business, please?" "Tell him," said Bart, with immense satisfaction, "that his boss is here, Bart Steele, and wants to see him right away." It had a sort of disrupting effect. She seemed to go blurred at the edges. After a minute, blinking carefully, she spoke into the vision screen and reported numbly, "Go on up, Mr. Steele." He wasn't expecting a welcome. He said so as the elevator rose. After all, if I'd never come back, he'd doubtless have inherited the whole 8 colors line unencumbered. I don't expect he'll be happy to see me, but he's the only one I can turn to. The elevator stopped, opened. He stepped out, and a man stepped nervously toward him. For a moment, expecting Raynor One, Bart was deceived. Then as the man's face spread into a smile of welcome, he stopped in incredulous delight. "Raynor Three!" In overflowing gladness, Bart hugged him. It was like a meeting with the dead. He felt as if he had really come home. But But you remember me?" he exclaimed, backing away in amazement. Slowly, the man nodded. His eyes were grave. "Yes, I decided it wasn't worth it, Bart, to go on losing everything that meant anything to me. Even if it meant I had to give up the stars, never travel again except as a passenger. I couldn't go on being afraid to remember, never knowing the consequences or responsibilities of what I've done." His sad smile was strangely beautiful. "The multiphase sailed without me. I've been here, hoping against hope that someday I'd know the rest." Associations clicked into place in Bart's mind. the multiphase. So Raynor 3 was the Mentorian who had smuggled David Briscoe off the ship, and whose memories, wrung out by the Lhari captain of that ship, had touched off so many deaths. But he had to pay for that. Paid many times over. And now must he pay for this, too? Raynor 1 strode toward him. So, it's really you. I thought it might be a trap, but 3 wouldn't listen. Word came from Antares that Montano had been arrested and his ship confiscated for illegal landing on Lhari. Thought you were probably dead. We sent a boy to do a man's job, Raynor 3 said, and he came back a man. But tell me, he looked curiously at Ring and Meta. Bart introduced them, adding, I came for help, really. I'm facing charges, and I'm afraid you are too. Raynor 1 said harshly, a trap, after all, 3. He trapped you, and he's led the Lhari to you. No, Raynor 3 said, or he wouldn't be walking around free and unguarded with all his memories intact. Tell me about it, Bart. And when Bart had given a quick narration of the Lhari judgment, he nodded slowly. That's all we ever wanted. Don't think you failed, Bart. The horrible part was only the way they were trying to keep it secret. Ring interrupted. Do not judge the Lhari by them, Raynor 3. And Raynor 3 said in good Lhari, I don't, Feathertop. Raynors have been working with Lhari since the days of Raison of Nedris. But I wanted an open, official statement of Lhari policy, not secret murders by fanatics. I had confidence in the Lhari as a people, but not in individuals. What good did it do to know that the Lhari Council in another galaxy would have condemned the murders and manhunts when they were going on in this one, day after day? Don't you see, Bart? He continued. You didn't fail. Not if we're going to have the publicity of a test case publicly heard. That means the Lhari are prepared to admit before our whole galaxy that humans can survive warp drive without cold sleep. That's all David Briscoe was trying to prove, or your father either. May they rest in peace. So, whatever happens, we've won. If you two idealists will give me a minute for cold realities, Raynor 1 said. There's this. Among other things, Bart's not yet of legal age. You may not know this, Bart, but your father appointed me your legal guardian. When I turned you over to 3, I'm afraid, I assumed legal responsibility for all the consequences. I ought to have kept you under my own supervision. Bart smiled at Raynor 1's stern face. I crossed 2 galaxies and faced the Lhari High Council without you to hold my hand. I can face the Trade Federation. Naturally, I will be responsible for your defense, Raynor 1 said stiffly. But I don't need a defense, Bart said, turning to Raynor 3 and meeting his eyes. I'm going to tell the truth, and let it stand. Don't worry. I'll make sure they don't hold you responsible for my actions. Another thing, some lunatic from Capella arrived here and all but accused me of having you murdered. Do you know a Tommy Kendron? Do I know him? Bart interrupted with a joyful yell. Tommy's here? Quick, where do I get in touch with him? An hour later, they were all gathered at Raynor 3's country house. The talk went on far into the night. Tommy wanted to know everything, and both Raynors wanted to know every detail of Bart's year among the Lhari, while Meta and Ring were both curious about how it had begun. Bart tried to forget that the next day might bring trouble, even imprisonment. The Lhari Council had told him to talk as much as he liked about his voyage, and this might be his only chance. When he had finished, Tommy leaned forward and gripped Bart's hand tightly. You make them sound pretty decent people, he said, looking at Ring. A year ago, if you told me I'd be here with a Lhari spaceman and a bunch of Mentorians, I'd never have believed it. Nor I. That I would be as friend under a human roof. Ring replied, but a friend to Bart is my friend also. He touched the faint, discolored scars on his brow softly, saying, but for Bart, I would not be here to greet anyone, man or Lhari, as friend. So, said Tommy triumphantly, you haven't failed, even if you didn't discover the secret of the 8th color. But a sudden, blinding light burst over Bart as Ring moved his hand to the scar. Once again he searched a cave beneath a green star, where Ring lay unconscious and bleeding, and played his Lhari light fearfully over a waterfall of colored minerals. And there was one whose color he could not identify. Red, blue, violet, green. None of these. The color of an unknown star in an unknown galaxy. The shimmer of a landing Lhari ship. The color of an unknown element in an unknown fuel. The secret of the 8th color, he said, and stood up, his hands literally shaking in excitement. I'm an idiot. No, don't ask me questions. I could be still wrong. But even if I go to a prison planet, the 8th color isn't a secret anymore. When the others had gone back to the city, he sat with Raynor III in the room where the latter had told him of his father's death, where he had first seen his terrifying Lhari face. They spoke little, but Raynor III finally asked, were you serious about not wanting a defense, Bart? I was. All I want is a chance to tell my own story in my own way, where everyone will hear me. Raynor III looked at him curiously. There's something you're not telling me, Bart. Want to tell me? Bart hesitated, then held out his hand and clasped his kinsman. Thanks, but no. Raynor III saw his hesitation and chuckled. All right, son. Forget I asked. You've grown up. It was good to sleep in a soft human-type bed again, to eat breakfast and shave and dress in ordinary human clothing again. But Bart folded his Lhari tights and the cloak tenderly, with regret. They were the memory of an experience no one else would ever have. Raynor III let him take the controls as they flew back to the spaceport city, and a little before noon they entered the great crystal pylon that was the headquarters of the Federation Trade Bureau on Procyon Alpha. Men and Lhari were moving in the lobby. Among them, Bart saw Vorongil, Meta at his side. He smiled at her, received a wan smile in return. Would Vorongil feel that Bart had deceived him, betrayed him, when he heard Bart today? In the hearing room, 4 white-crusted Lhari sat across from 4 dignified, well-dressed men, representatives of the Federation of Intergalactic Trade. The space beyond was wholly filled with people, crowded together and carrying stereo cameras, intercom equipment, and creepy peepee of the on-the-spot space commentator. Mr. Steele, we had hoped to make this a quiet hearing without undue publicity, but we cannot deny the news media of the privilege of covering it unless you wish to claim the right to privacy. No, indeed, Bart said clearly. I want them all to hear what I'm going to say. Raynor I came to the bench. Bart, as your guardian, I advise against it. Some people will call this a publicity stunt. It won't do 8 colors any good to admit that men have been spying on the Lhari. I want press coverage, Bart repeated stubbornly, and as many star systems on the relay as possible. All right, but I wash my hands of it, Raynor I said angrily. Bart told his story, simply. His meeting with the Elder Briscoe, his meeting with Raynor I, carefully not implicating Raynor I in the plot. Raynor III's work in altering his appearance to that of a Lhari, and the major events of his cruise on the Swiftwing. When he came to the account of the shift into warp drive, he saw the faces of the press reporters and realized that for them this was the story of the year, or century. Humans can endure star drive. But he went on, not soft-pedaling Montano's attempted murder, his own choice, the trip to the Lhari world. One of the board representatives interrupted hastily. "What is the point of this lengthy narrative? You can give this story to the newsmen without our official sanction. If you want to make it a heroic epic, young Steele, we have heard sufficient to prove your guilt and that of Raynor in the violation of treaty. Nevertheless, I want this official," Bart said. "I don't want to be mobbed when they hear that I have the secret of the star drive." The effect was electric. The four Lhari sat up. Their white crests twitched. Vorongil stared, his gray eyes darkening with fear. One of the Lhari leaned forward, shooting the question at him harshly. "You did not discover the coordinates of the council planet of Ki Lhiro. You did not discover—" "I did not," said Bart quietly. "I don't know them, and I have no intention of trying to find them. We don't need to go to the Lhari galaxy to find the mineral that generates the warp frequencies that they call Catalyst A, and that the Mentorians call the eighth color. There is a green star called Meristem, and a spectroscopic analysis of that star, I'm sure, will reveal what unknown elements it contains, and perhaps locate other stars with that element. There must be others in our galaxy, but the coordinates of the star Meristem are known to me." Vorongil was staring at him, his mouth open. He leaped up and cried out, shaking, "But they assured us that among your memories there was nothing of danger to us." Compassionately, gently, Bart said, "There wasn't. Not that they knew about, Vorongil. I didn't realize it myself. I might never have remembered seeing a mineral that was of a color not found in the spectrum. Certainly, a memory like that meant nothing to the Lhari medics who emptied out my mind and turned over all my thoughts. You Lhari can't see color at all. So no one but I saw the color of the mineral in the cave. You Lhari yourselves don't know that your fuel looks unlike anything else in the universe. You never cared to find out how your world looked to your Mentorians. So your medics never questioned my memories of an eighth color. To you, it's just another shade of gray. But under a light strong enough to blind any but Mentorian eyes, it takes on a special color." The conference broke out in disorder, the four Lhari clustering together in a furious babble, then hastily leaving the room. Bart stood waiting, feeling empty and cold. Vorongil's stare baffled him with unreadable emotion. "You fool! You unspeakable young idiot!" Raynor groaned. "Why did you blurt it out like that before every news media in the galaxy? Why, we could have had a monopoly on the star drive, 8 colors, and Vega interplanet." As he saw the men of the press approaching with their microphones, lights, cameras, and TV equipment, he gripped Bart urgently by the arm. "We can still salvage something. Don't talk anymore. Refer them to me. Say I'm your guardian and your business manager. You can still make something of this." "That's just what I don't want to do," Bart replied, and broke away from him to approach the newsman. "Yes, certainly, I'll answer all your questions, gentlemen." Raynor One flung up his hands in despair, but over their shoulder he saw the glowing face of Meta, and smiled. She, at least, would understand. So would Raynor 3. A page boy touched Bart on the arm. "Mr. Steele," he said, "you are to appear immediately before the World Council." He was to be asked one question again and again in the days that followed. But his real answer was to Meta and Raynor 3, looking quietly past Raynor 1 and speaking to the news cameras that would carry his words all over the galaxy to men and Lhari. Why didn't I keep it for myself? Because there are always men like Montano, who in their mistaken pride will murder and steal for such things. I want this knowledge to be open to all men, to be used for their benefit. There has been too much secrecy already. I want all men to have the stars." He had to tell the story again and again to the hastily summoned representatives of the Galactic Federation. At one point, the delegate from his home star of Vega actually rose and shouted to him, "This is treason! You betrayed your home world and the whole human race. Don't you know the Lhari may fight a war over this?" Bart remembered Varangil's silent, sad confession to the Lhari fears. "No," he said gently. "No, there won't be any war unless we start one. The Lhari won't start any war. Believe me." But inwardly he sweated. What would the Lhari do? They had to wait for representatives of the Lhari Council to make the journey from their home galaxy. Meanwhile, they kept Bart in protective custody. There was, of course, no question of sending him to a prison planet. Public opinion would have crucified any government that suggested punishment for the man who had discovered a human world within the deposits of Catalyst A. Bart could claim an explorer's share, and Raynor 1 had lost no time in filing that claim on his behalf. But he was lonely and anxious. They had confined him to a set of rooms high in the building overlooking the spaceport. From the balcony, he could see the ships landing and departing. Life went on. Ships came and went, and out there in the vast night of space, the suns and colors flamed and rolled, heedless of the little atoms that traveled and intrigued between them. The night came when the buzzer sounded, and he opened the door to Raynor 1 and Raynor 3. "Better turn on your vision screen, Bart. The elder of the Lhari Council has arrived with their official decision, and he's going to announce it." Bart waited, anxiously pacing the room, while on the TV screen various dignitaries presented the elder. "We are the first race to travel the stars." A bald head of an ancient Lhari face seemed like glazed pottery looked at Bart from the screen, and Bart remembered when he had stood before that face, sick with defeat. But now he need not pretend to hold his head erect. "We have had a long and triumphant time as masters of the stars," the Lhari said. "But triumph and power will sicken and stagnate the race which holds them too long unchallenged. We reached this point once before. Then a Lhari captain, Razan of Nedron, abandoned the safe ways of caution, and out of this blind leap in the blind dark came many good things. Trade with the human race, our Mentorian allies, a system of mathematics to take the hazards from our star travel. Yet, once again the Lhari had grown cautious and fearful, and a young man named Bartol took a blind leap into unknown darkness, all alone." "Not alone," Bart said as if to himself. "It took two men called Briscoe, and my father, and a couple of Raynors, and even a man called Montano, because without that, I'd never have decided. Like Razan of Nedron, like all pioneers, this young man has been cursed by his own people, the very ones who will one day benefit from his daring. He has found his people a firm footing among the stars. It is too late for the Lhari to regret that we did not sooner extend you the hand of welcome there. You have climbed, unaided, to join us. For good or ill, we must make room for you. But there is room for all. Competition is the lifeblood of trade, and we face the future without fear, knowing that life still holds many surprises for the living. I say to you, welcome to the stars." Even while Bart stood speechless with the knowledge of success, the door opened again, and Bart, turning, cried out in amazement, "Tommy, Ring, Meta!" "Sure," Tommy explained. "We've got to celebrate." But Bart stopped, looking past them. "Captain Varangil, he said, and went to greet the old Lhari. I thought you'd hate me. Riekomori. The term of respect fell naturally from his lips. I did. For a time, Vorongil said quietly. But I remember the day we stood on Lharilis by the monument, and that you risked, perhaps your life, certainly your eyesight, to save us from death. So when the elder asked for my estimate of your people, I gave it. I thought it sounded like you. Bart felt that his happiness was complete. And now, Ring cried, let's celebrate. Meta, you haven't even told him that he's free. But while the party got rolling, Bart wondered, free for what? And after a little while he went out on the balcony and stood looking down at the spaceport, where the Swiftwing lay in shadow, huge, beloved, renounced. What now, Bartol? Vorongil's quiet voice asked from his elbow. You are famous, notorious. You're going to be rich and a celebrity. I was wishing I could get away until the excitement dies down. Well, said Vorongil, why don't you? The Swiftwing ships out tonight for Antares and beyond. It will be a couple of years before your 8 colors can be made over into an interstellar line, and as Raynor 1 has said to me several times, you'll have to handle all those details, for you're not of age yet. I've been thinking, now that we Lhari must share space with your people, you'll need experienced men for your ships. Unless we all want the disasters born of trial and error, we Lhari had better help you train your men quickly and well. I want you to go back on the Swiftwing with me. Not an apprentice, but representative of 8 colors, to act as liaison between men and Lhari, at least until your own affairs claim your attention. Behind them on the balcony, Tommy appeared, making signals at Bart. Say yes, Bart, I did. Bart's eyes suddenly filled. Out of defeat, he had won success beyond his greatest hopes. But he did not feel all glad. He felt only a heavy responsibility. Whether good or bad came out of the gift he had snatched from the stars, would rest in large measure on his own shoulders. He was going back to space, to learn the responsibilities that went with it. I accept, he said gravely. Oh boy, Bart. Tommy dragged Ring into a sort of war dance of exuberant celebration, pointing at the flaring glow of the spaceport gates. Here, by grace of the Lhari, stands the doorway to all the stars, he quoted. Well, maybe you were here first, but look out, we're coming. A doorway to the stars. Bart had crossed that doorway once, frightened and alone. Dad, if you could only know. The first interstellar ship of 8 colors was to bear the name Bart Steele, but that was years in the future. Now, looking at the Swiftwing, at Ring and Tommy and Raynor 3 and Vorongil, who would all be his shipmates in the new world they were building, he felt suddenly very lonely again. Come in, Bart. It's your party, Meta said softly, and he felt her hand lying on his. He looked down at the pretty Mentorian girl. She would be with him, too, and suddenly he knew he would never be lonely again. His arm around Meta, his friends, Man and Lhari, at his shoulder. He went back to the celebration to plan for the first intergalactic voyage to the stars. The end. Ba-da-da! We did it. Yay! Okay, so chapter 14, our last chapter, are like the, I guess, more consequences. So chapter 13 was Bart going in front of the court for, like, the Lhari court, but he did atrocities on Procyon Alpha, so he went back to Procyon Alpha. We have a reunion with Raynor 1 and 3, and Bart just decides, well, he makes the connection that he saw several times this unknown color, this 8th color. and just didn't make the connection that that is the fuel. Like he's seen it in places where he knows how to get to and where humans will be able to go without going into like warp speed hyperdrive into other galaxies to get it. So he makes this connection in his brain, and then he's having a press conference as well as the council hearing at the same time. And so he's making his confessions and he tells his whole story. And then he reveals that he knows where we can get the fuel. He knows the eighth color and he talks about it and is like, yeah, and like I know where to go for that. And people are like, what are you talking about? Why are you saying this? Like the Lhari are. And so like the Lhari that are there, like Varangil, leave, and Raynor One, who is technically his guardian, is like, dude, stop talking. We need to monopolize this. I will handle all of the questions. And Bart is very adamant about this not being a secret anymore and everybody having access to this travel because this is what spurred, lies and deceit and possible murder from people like Montano and things like that. And he's like, that's not how it should be. And so we're all happy, having a good time. And there is this celebration at the end because now Bart is like freed from all charges, nothing bad or anything like that. And Bart's like, well, I don't really know what I'm gonna do. And Varangilla is like, you dope. Come with me because like Raynor One has told me millions of times that he is going to handle all of the details of your intergalactic travel for eight colors. So you're not going to be able to really do anything. So you need to come with me, and you will need a crew for your company because nobody else knows how to do it except Lhari. So let's train. Let's train. We will train the people on how to do this. So that's pretty cool. I like it. I like it. And that's the end. Everything is a big ol' happy ending. I know. Happy ending. What? It's the never ending story. Exactly. We're just gonna start from the beginning and read the whole thing over again. But we did it. That's it. Them's the breaks. We'll be starting a new book next time, which is going to be determined by Patreon. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for hanging out. It's been a pleasure. It's been a treat and a half. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.